So the second section in Chapter 17, as you all know since you all read Chapter 17, is modes of speciation. So in the first section we talked about how speciation happens with, or why, with the biological species concept, all the different species concepts. But now we're going to talk about how it happens, how it actually happens. So there's speciation is defined as the splitting of one species into two or more species, or the transformation of one species into another. So it doesn't necessarily have to split into two, but it will change from one, have so many significant changes it would be a different species. So that's the definition of speciation, as you should remember from the last video. And there's two different types, and these two different types depend on whether or not there's a geographical barrier present. And so these two types are allopatric and sympatric speciation. The first one is allopatric speciation, and this occurs when two populations of the same species. So remember, species meaning they're all, depending on what species concept we want to use, but we're going to use biological in this case, so they can all interbreed with each other. Two populations, so living in two different areas, they're separated by a physical or geographical barrier. So even though when they get separated, we still see the microevolutionary forces at work. So genetic drift, changes in allelic frequencies, gene flow, mutation, migration, all those things are still working on each of these populations individually. And since so many of those things are due to chance or due to environmental change or whatever, they're going to have a pretty big effect on two different species of that. So as time goes on, the two populations are going to exhibit different changes due to the microevolutionary forces, and so we're going to see differences in alleles and traits become bigger and bigger between the two populations, and eventually they might lead to reproductive isolation and two new species, because as we get reproductive isolation, we get new species. So allopatric speciation occurs when two species are split, or two populations are split because of a geographical barrier, and they follow their own evolutionary path, and they become so different they can't interbreed anymore. So a good example of this that your textbook gives was of the Ensatina salamanders, which are found all over California. So they started off with an ancestral population that was found in the Pacific Northwest, and then a group migrated south, and then they saw a lot of different barriers between them. So one is the Central Valley Barrier, which is a pretty large valley in the middle of California, which split populations, and as north moved to south, they stopped interbreeding with each other. So there were individual selection pressures on each group, meaning different traits are selected for in each group. So for whatever reason, this one, Ensatina eschesoltiplatensis, that lives over here in the eastern part of the state, for whatever reason, having red and white spots, or red and black spots, was more adaptive and allowed for the fitness to be higher of that group. Different from these ones over here, which were a different color, and these guys, and these guys, and these guys. And in addition to color, they probably have evolved different traits, like diet, behavioral traits. They've evolved different behavioral traits. And so now they've reached reproductive isolation. The males of this group down here may not recognize the females of this group, so they can't mate anymore. They may mate at different times, because down here it makes more sense to mate in the early spring, whereas up here it makes more sense to mate in the late spring. For whatever reason, now they've developed reproductive isolation, and now we have 5 different new species of the salamander. That is allopatric speciation, due to differences in geography. Then we have sympatric speciation. This one's a little more complicated because this is what happens without the presence of a geographical barrier. So it often comes from a change in microhabitat or diet, we'll talk about that, or it happens very often in plants due to changes in chromosome numbers. So, for example, sympatric speciation, differences in microhabitat. What happens is they can still live in the same area, but kind of find a specific niche within that area. So the example that your textbook gives is of cichlids in a lake in Nicaragua. And so what happens in this lake in Nicaragua is all the fish still live in that same lake. Can't be too big. Obviously, no lake is so large, most lakes aren't so large, that there's block in gene flow between a population. They're all capable of breeding with each other, all these fish. But a lot of fish, they started off living along the edge of the lake in the rocky areas, and then so they all interbreed together there. And then a bunch of them moved out into the open water. And so they can still, and they adapted to living in the open water, so they can still breed with each other. They're not far from each other. the coast from the open water is still totally capable of interbreeding, but they just kind of separated and adapted to their own specific areas. So the fish that lived in the open water only started breeding with the fish that lived in the open water, etc., and they eventually became two species. So that's an example of sympatric speciation. The more common one happens in plants. And so what happens with that is we see something called polyploidy. And that is multiple copies of chromosomes more than 2n. So remember that us anyways, all cells in our bodies have 2 copies of each chromosome, one from mom, one from dad. And our gametes are n. They have 1 copy of each chromosome. In plants, because of self-fertilization and things like that, it's often very likely that they have increased numbers of chromosomes. So the first kind of this is called autoploidy. So auto means with yourself, so think of it that way. So autoploidy comes from non-disjunction during meiosis, which remember means that the homologous chromosomes don't get pulled apart during anaphase 1 of meiosis. So instead they both go into one gamete. And so if that were to happen with all of them, then suddenly all of the chromosomes are in one gamete and another gamete has none. This is actually in a figure on, or figure 1010 in your textbook. Shows non-disjunction if you're confused about that. And so now we have diploid gametes, which is different than usual. Normally we have haploid gametes. So the presence of diploid gametes, having 2 copies of each chromosome, changes things. So if we have a diploid gamete and then it goes and fuses with a regular haploid gamete, 2 copies, 1 copy, now we have 3 copies of each chromosome inside that gamete. This is called a triploid plant. So it'll grow to be a full plant, but it will have 3 copies of each chromosome, and it will be sterile. The reason that it's sterile, it can't produce more offspring, is because the chromosomes don't have matches during meiosis. So remember that the homologous chromosomes line up during meiosis, but if there's 3 copies, there's going to be one that doesn't have a match. So they can't make offspring. So they are sterile. However, if we have this diploid gamete that we got from this non-disjunction, and it matches up with another diploid gamete, most likely from the same plant, because plants can self-fertilize. So most likely, this diploid gamete found another diploid gamete from the same plant. Now they fuse. Now this zygote has 4 copies of each chromosome. We call that tetraploid, and now it's a tetraploid plant. Now, if this tetraploid plant were to find another tetraploid, they could match, because all the chromosomes would have matches during meiosis, and they would make offspring. These are actually used a lot in agriculture, because if you have a triploid plant, then it's sterile, it's not making offspring. It's still making fruit, however, but the fruit just isn't leading to any offspring. Those fruit are not going to have seeds because they're not making offspring. So triploid plants make fruit that don't have seeds. So if you ever had seedless fruit, it might have come from a triploid plant. Tetraploid plants are often have fruit that are much larger. So this is an advantage for the agriculture industry as well if they want to make larger fruit to sell to you. So actually, the strawberries that you buy in the store that are really big, those are 8N. They have 8 copies of each chromosome, and that's why the strawberries are so large. So that's autoploidy. That's what happens from non-disjunction. There's a second example, which is alloploidy, which is hybridization of 2 different but related species of plant. So this is what happens when 2 species of plants that are related to each other, they wouldn't often be mating with each other, but they do, but they have different numbers of chromosomes. So that can lead to a problem, but in this case, it's successful. So here we have this plant right here. Its 2N number is 14. This one's 2N number is 10. So this one's making gametes that have 5 chromosomes. This one's making gametes that have 7. They fuse. Sperm, egg come together to form a hybrid. Now this hybrid has 7 from one, 5 from the other. It has a chromosome number of 12. However, they can't match up because they're different chromosomes. But if they were to double the chromosome number, synthesize a new copy of DNA, now each chromosome has a match and it has a 2N number of 24. So it's made a new species right there. This one is Clarkia consina. This one is Clarkia virgata. This one is Clarkia pulchella. It's like a mix of the 2. And this happens a lot actually in plants, and that has led to huge variation in plant species. And so many of the plant species that have evolved have come from allopatric speciation, from alloploidy. Then we have a couple other things to talk about. One of them is adaptive radiation. And adaptive radiation is defined in your textbook as speciation that occurs when a single ancestral species rapidly gives rise to a radiation of new species as each adapts to a specific environment. And this often happens from the removal of competition. So basically what happens is, for whatever reason, some competition is removed. A predator is gone, anything like that. Suddenly there's nothing stopping this species from flourishing, and it adapts and it evolves, and quickly, very quickly. So a really good example of this are the Galapagos finches. There was no competition removed here. Well, I guess there was. They moved to these new islands, and their competitors from the old islands, from the mainland, are gone. So the Galapagos finches have arrived on the different islands, one on each island, let's say, and now they have all this space to evolve. And so that's why we got so many different kinds of finches. The example your textbook gives are the Hawaiian honeycreepers, which happen right here. It shows that this started off all as one ancestral species. And then something called ecological release happened. The removal of competition allowed the expansion of species like crazy. So all these guys came from one. And for whatever reason, ecological release happened, and they were free to evolve into many different species. Another good example of this is the extinction of the dinosaurs. So the dinosaurs populated so much of the earth and kept other species down because they were many of them were such predators or were so strong that they were taking up all the resources. But with the extinction of the dinosaurs, mammals flourished. Suddenly they had all this space, they had all these resources, they had all this food, and they weren't being preyed on anymore. So if we look at the fossil record, as the decline of the dinosaurs happened, we see a huge rise in mammal species. And not just the number of mammals, but the types of mammals, because they fit into all these different niches, and they evolved into what we have today. Then there's also convergent evolution, which you guys should be pretty familiar with. So convergent evolution is when a similar biological trait evolves in two unrelated species as a result of exposure to similar environments. So you guys remember this, analogous traits and homologous traits. So for example, the bird and the bat, they show convergent evolution. They've both evolved wings and muscles to move these wings and a very lightweight body, that way they can fly. But the bird and the bat, they do have similar bone structure, but they're not very related. They have tons of other ancestors that didn't fly. So they evolved the same trait because of similar habitats. They fit into the flying niche, so it made the most sense for them to evolve flight. A good example that your textbook gives are the African cichlids, so different group of cichlids. These guys right here, they're two different species of cichlids. One was there ancestrally, and then one moved in way after, and this is how they started off looking, and they changed over time, but eventually they ended up looking almost exactly the same because it made the most sense in their habitat for them to look that way. So that is section 17.2, modes of speciation.